moving El Nino to El Nino watch. Did anybody hear that anywhere on the press? Any? So the Bureau of Meteorology, there we go. The Bureau of Meteorology, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, moved this from inactive to what? So they're saying the chance of an El Nino in spring is now 50%. So they're saying that there's a 50% chance of an El Nino happening in spring. So first question is, if you knew nothing, what's the chance of an El Nino happening in spring? The answer is not 50%. So if you had no knowledge, what's the chance of an El Nino happening in spring? Any takers? Think of a number, any number. So how many? What do you reckon the chance of an El Nino is?
10%.
10%? Higher. So it's about 25%. So in the last 100 years, there have been about 25 El Ninos. So if you knew nothing, you'd say there's a 25% chance of El Nino. But therein is a problem. If we say El Nino means drought, then the problem is that there have been more El Ninos than bad droughts. Does that make sense? So by definition, a drought is 10% of the time. If you say drought is 25 or 30% of the time, the advice is to move, because you basically think your area is dry. I mean, you're not coping with what it is. So drought has to be less than 10% of the time. So we're saying the chance of El Nino has gone from 25% to 50%. And what this tries to show you is, what does El Nino mean for Nuri temperature and rainfall? So if you have that graph, just you can see at the top there is just the, for rainfall is basically, generally we have less rainfall through winter in an El Nino. Does that make sense? So we tend to have very little difference in summer rainfall. So the orange line is El Nino and the blue line is La Nina. So we tend to have more rain with La Nina. 2010-11 was a La Nina. 2016 was an Indian Ocean dipole negative. 2015, which was drier, was an El Nino. So that's the difference there. Now, below that there is a little just get my little wheel out just a moment. So if you were thinking about spring rainfall in the Barossa, you have an equal chance of being in the bottom third of years, middle third of years, or top third of years. Does that make sense? So basically, if you're just planning on long-term climate odds, we have equal chance of all of these. And so what we do is there's 100 nails there, and we have equal chance of all these happening. And we spin the wheel. This is when I say the Bureau has a really big one of these, and we get an outcome, okay. So that's just random sampling or distribution. What does El Nino mean? It doesn't mean that I can tell you which nail it will end up on. Nor does it mean, as the media will usually say, we know it will mean drought. What it means is that the chance of being in the bottom third increases up to over 50%. We still spin the wheel, we still randomly sample from the distribution. So that's saying, when we locate the last 25 El Ninos, about half of them have been in the bottom third of years. So we've revised that. So we still spin the wheel, there's still random standard distribution, there's half a chance of so you can get an okay year in an El Nino, okay? Does that make sense? So what we're saying is that we've changed the odds. But the swing in odds here for Nuri surprised me. They're fairly significant, okay? So the chance of getting the swing in odds for this May to September period is quite significant. For October to December, but then for January to March, it doesn't make much difference. So in terms of grape growth, it's about spring, not about spring and early summer, not about later summer. Does that make sense? So there's very little impact on later summer, but we tend to get drier springs when we have El Nino. Has anyone heard of the Indian Ocean dipole? So that's another. So really, when you go north of Australia, we've got the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean, and when we have the Indian Ocean dipole being negative, we also get drier conditions. So there's a sort of bar there which has for April to October rainfall for all years. For neutral years, for El Nino years, you can see the chance of being the bottom 20% in El Nino years goes from 20% up to almost 60%. It's a very big revision of the chance of a dry spring in El Nino. Doesn't guarantee it, but that swing is pretty big. And you can see at the bottom there with Indian Ocean dipole. So many of the Indian Ocean dipole years are the same. Okay, so I'll just flick it over and we'll talk about temperature. But before, any quick questions on that rainfall? Does that make sense? That what we're saying with rainfall? Down the bottom there is where we've just done for the chance. So I know viticulture is irrigated, but still you're relying in the Barossa. You're still relying a lot on spring rainfall because you're not putting anything like the full requirement in through irrigation, are you? So there's still spring rainfall is an important contributor. And down the bottom there, moisture balance. All this is doing is saying, let's take today's rainfall and minus evaporation. So rainfall for evaporation today is fairly low. It might be 1.5 millimetres or something. It's a cool day. But in the middle of summer, evaporation, EPAN, might be up around 8 millimetres or something. So it might be as high as 8 millimetres then. So what we do is we say, how much rain was on this on today, minus evaporation, and then we have, what we're saying is, if we had a 10 millimetre bucket, and just let that fill and empty, how many days would that have some water in it? Does that make sense? So we're just taking a very simple 10 millimetre full bucket. If we get 20 millimetres, it'll overflow. But if we get 5 millimetres and then we match that, and we have there's a little bit of memory there, and really that's a simple way to look at. So in 2010-11, when we were looking at the very bad disease outbreaks, we were using that as a simple way to model what was happening in viticulture in the Barossa. What you see there is, again, in El Nino years, the chance of that, of being in the bottom third of years for that, is greatly increased. So El Nino years tend to be better years for disease control. La Nina years tend to be worse years for disease control. So you tend to get big differences in that as well, but not only is rainfall less, but evaporation is more. Flipping the page, I know viticulture is very interested in temperature, so what do past El Ninos and Indian Ocean dipoles mean for temperature? The top line there is growing degree days. So people familiar with growing degree days, that's just taking the mean temperature, so taking the mean temperature and minus 10 from it. So if it's 30 degrees maximum and 10 degrees minimum, the mean temperature is 20. You take 10 off that, and that gives you 10 growing degree days. If it's 40 and 20, you're going to have 20 degree days. So it's a way plants measure time by temperature. The grapevine measures time by temperature largely. And so what happens is you can look at that number of degree days, and there we can see roughly there that it takes about 350 degrees days to flower, about 1100 for raisin, and about 1250 for harvesting earlier varieties, and 1500 for harvesting later varieties. Fruit load will also affect, once you go beyond flowering, as you would know better than me, the fruit load and so on will also affect when harvest is, and when the winemaker wants the grapes is also factors in that as well. So, but you can see there at the top that generally in El Nino years, there's an impact on spring temperature. So we tend to get warmer spring temperature. Does that make sense? And in La Nina years, cooler spring temperatures, but once we get into summer, it's less so. So really the impact in terms of El Nino tends to be very much what happens in spring. From bud burst up to flowering and pushing that along faster. And there seems to be a difference there. And then and that translates and it carries through to the chance of an earlier season or a later season. But I think that the important thing is that most of that is known in spring. Using El Nino isn't going to tell you a lot about the end of the season. And then at the bottom there are frosts. You would expect that there would be more frost in an El Nino year. So anyone want to guess why there would be more frost in El Nino year than a La Nina? Pardon? Dry ground, yeah. So two things. One's the dry ground. So water has a really high specific heat. There's water, that's why people will irrigate as one way to manage frost. But also just clear skies. So you'll get a frost if you have cold, clear nights. So cool, clear nights with no wind. And so those very, very clear skies because the frosts we will get in the Barossa are radiation frosts. They're just where there's outgoing heat. And really what it's saying is that on those nights, there's nothing between you and outer space. And you're just losing heat very, very quickly in that situation. And that's why mulch will slow that process down and so on. Whereas it's just bare soil, you lose that, bare dry soil, you lose that very quickly, and the top of the grapevines will be very, very cold in that situation. So again, if we were to have an El Nino, that tends to be years where we get more frost. However, the very late spring frost has a very much a sort of jagged weather aspect. So we tend to get more frost in El Nino years, but predicting that late spring frost is really difficult to get right. So you can get a very bad late spring frost in a La Nina or an El Nino. You tend to, if you're betting on the number of frosts, you're safer with El Nino than trying to bet on the date of the last frost. Does that make sense? So the date of the last frost is very difficult to get right, and because it's largely a weather event. So I'm really happy to take questions here for a bit from people generally, and then I'm happy to come and tell me, talk individually. But I guess an important point is that the Bureau of Meteorology, half the time it goes to an El Nino watch, it goes back to neutral. And half the time it will go on to an El Nino alert and develop into an El Nino, okay? So really, on the 17th, there'll be an update on the Bureau website, and it's worth seeing what they're saying. And so what that would mean, if we were to go to El Nino, is an increased chance of drier conditions, but remember it's a random sampling, we don't know for sure. It's a increased chance of drier conditions. With that, drier conditions comes more frost and warmer conditions and more heat events. But most of that is in this calendar year. There's surprising little effect into the following year, which is sort of surprising because El Nino means the Christ child, and it refers, or the boy child, and it refers to Christmas time. So the Peruvian fishermen we're using it around fishing time, and in other parts of the world, in America, in the Philippines, and other parts of the world, most of the impact is into the next quarter of the year. Our impact in Australia in these areas tends to be very much in the spring, early summer, and then it dies off from there.
But what's the lead time between, say, the Bureau of Met watch and then active? What's the...
You can see that here. That's a good question, is how long does it go from active into that? Well, an El Nino can't develop overnight. It can't, it won't, it's not as if suddenly on the 17th they'll say it's in a, what a surprise is in it. Well, meteorology is not a surprise-free occupation, okay? So there's plenty of surprises, but you'll be very, so you see here it steps from a watch to an alert, and these are months. So that went from a watch to, this is 2015, went from a work, but in 2015, from very early on, everybody was talking about El Nino, partly because 2014 wanted to be an El Nino and couldn't quite get there. Does that make sense? So it tried to get there in 2014, didn't happen, and then everything was primed and it happened in 2015. This year, we've come out of a weak La Nina, and so we're not expecting it. This is a bit of a surprise here, but where this goes into the future, really nobody knows. There's a 50% chance of this kicking up. I mean, this can kick along like this, and then it might kick up into, but if it's going to happen, it's got to really happen by, let's say, September, October. That's the sort of timing where that sort of is likely to go into that ENSO cycle.
So it's something like months rather than...
That's right. It's months, but when you go to the website, you'll see, there's things that you can, and that's why they're concerned. This is a fish tank view of the Pacific Ocean, and you can see that's March, April, May, June, and you can see this movement of warm water. This is South America. You are here, and you can see that in March we were La Nina-ish. It was cool over there and warm over here. What we've done is it's moved across. So that's the sort of, but this is actually on updated all the time of the actual winds. And these winds would have to slacken and change the trade. And so they're watching that on a very close basis. And on the 17th, you see an update of that.
Right.
I guess I'd be interested if anyone could tell me if you did know it was going to be. So I don't know what spring's going to be like, and if I did, I probably wouldn't tell you. So, but if I did, let's pretend that we did have a really good forecast. What would you do differently if you knew we were heading for a drier and warmer spring? Would there be anything done differently in viticulture? You start irrigating earlier. So you film a profile earlier because, and so the worry of doing that if it does rain is that you've wasted the water or that you've got too much vigor. So what's the regret if you irrigate? What's the regret if you irrigate and stays wet and then you get some rain? Is there any serious regret there? Okay. So early irrigation is a pretty good bit of insurance policy, and you can sort of but that's something you might do. Would anyone buy more water in that or is there enough water in the system? Yeah. Yeah, that's a view. So are there? Yes, I guess that's the question. Is if you were to irrigate earlier in spring, is there any downside to irrigating earlier in spring other than the cost of the water? So people are pretty. Yeah. Yeah. And for frost here, are people, how do people manage frost? Is that like irrigation? I guess site selection and other ways of sort of try and manage that in the first place, but and you're a lot less frost prone than Spinawara. But yeah, frost is, and I do know there are some frost fans and so on around that. I mean, it's interesting. You know, there's Taylors and others using helicopters in Clare. So, are there any helicopters used in the Barossa at all for frost?
Coonawarra they did.
Yeah, and Marlborough, Tassie cherries and so on. Yeah, that's. So, if there was a frost warning, can you do anything differently? No, you just wear the frost. So you try and keep things.
We try to keep our floors clean, the blocks clean.
Okay. So, is there any interest in delayed pruning to change? Any interest in delayed pruning to mix things up a bit, to change phenology at all?
I don't believe it makes a big enough difference.
Okay. So the differences are small. Yeah.
You want to work a week or 10 days.
Okay.
So what's the point?
Yeah. Although for a winery, that stretch could be worth a bit.
Perhaps. Yep.
But you'd say for trying to avoid a frost or something, 10 days is unlikely to, because there'll be enough.
You might strike it lucky. You might prune. You might push your bud burst out a little bit and not get a frost.
Yeah.
If it bursts, you get a frost anyway. What's the difference?
Yeah. And the most damage is going to be when you've got shoots already starting and you get a frost, and so that's okay. So it's not, as a frost management thing, late pruning isn't going to.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
No, I agree.
So, but that small amount of change maybe for wineries where they're running.
I notice in the literature they refer a lot to the north and the east, but not so much to the south. Australia, when they talk about dipole,
Yeah.
you know, how it's going to affect
Yeah.
temperature. Have we got anything more specific on that?
Well, I guess those bars there are as good as it gets. So it's not the case that people in Queensland or New South Wales or somewhere else have much bigger swings than this. Okay, so these are about as good as it gets for spring. So for the rest of the year, there's much harder to get it right. But the impact of Enso and Indian-Ocean dipole on spring, so on the early part of the vintage is significant, and I guess there's more and more emphasis that basically, so traditionally people use the period October to April, but really we've got to start including September in our because September is a pretty important time for things starting and so on. And using October in the Riverland and forgetting, I mean, things are, it's ignoring, things are pretty green in the Riverland by September, aren't they? So really, this woman, Chelsea Jarvis, has done a PhD, and she's arguing that in terms of getting this stuff right, we should be moving these indices a bit earlier, because really using October, but that October to April gets reversed for the Northern Hemisphere when people want to do comparisons of where you can grow Chardonnay or something, and that's sort of in the literature that. But I think it's in both parts of the world we should be coming earlier in spring, because in recent years a warm spring will have a very big impact on the earlier harvest and so on, or a cool spring in the reverse in that previous year. So spring is a pretty important time. The good news of that is that you already know that by the time you come later in the season. But I realise I'm standing between you and pulled pork or whatever else. So I'm happy to have it to chat with anyone else. But and I guess pulling these together, we were surprised at two things. One was this very strong lack of following through to January. That doesn't mean that every El Nino or La Nina that happens, but really it's really about September, October, November, December. And the swings in the rainfall are pretty big, and it's about as big as the biggest swings you will get. Thank you.